Words, we will start our plenary session in which we invite four speakers to talk about the territories of technology, innovation and development, and really kind of asking them to contribute around a question: has technology been good, been bad, been indifferent to lots of places of our work, lots of parts of the world that we are engaging in? We have Dr. Silvia Masiero. She's Associate Professor of Information Sciences at the University of Oslo. She's also one of our two keynote speakers tomorrow, and she will give a brief overview of one of her research topics. Beside her, to the right, is Mr. Bernard Kirk. He's the CEO of the Camden Education Trust and also Innovative Communities. His work takes him all over Africa. His organization teaches mainly women tech and robotics. He's highly involved in the in STEM education all across the continent. So I think there's some really interesting things to say about that. Dr. Caroline Williamson Sinalo is a lecturer of world languages at UCC. She will bring a really interesting contribution to this plenary, and so will Dr. PJ Wall of the Adapt Center, Trinity, lecturer at TUD. Professor Bora Carmody is going to be the chair and leading the discussion. And with that, I'll hand over the microphone. Thank you very much for coming.
Speaker Nella. So you've kind of introduced everybody, so I guess we can start. So the panelists will speak for about 7 or 8 minutes each, and then we want this to be an interactive session where we get to hear from you. This is meant to be a kind of provocative opening to the conference and not us talking to you, but we want to have an interactive session where we want to be, or I'm speaking on behalf of the panelists, maybe I shouldn't be. I hope they want to be challenged by your questions, but we want to have some debate around these issues, and it's a very topical issue and a very important one. So with that, our first speaker is going to be Dr. Masiero.
So good evening, everybody, and a big thanks to the organizers for the privilege of being here from Oslo today. Very emotional, I must say, and for being here in such a wonderful company of colleagues and practitioners. I won't maybe use all my 7-8 minutes. I can make this Italian minutes, but then we will finish tomorrow. So I don't think I'm gonna keep my two let's say thought provocations. And yes, I do cite Padraig saying yes, I would love to continue this conversation with the co-panelists and the audience also over the reception. And I'll indeed have a chance to discuss these ideas with you tomorrow morning as well at the keynote. So I'm gonna keep this brief. 2 thought provocation in relation to, I really couldn't imagine a more thought-provoking question. Has technology actually, I like the word you used, Peter Nella, actually been good in this space of innovation and development? I think I'm gonna keep it to 1 good news and 1 bad news with using my activist researcher perspective in this space. I would say the study of ICT for development, and this I say as someone who works in the space of teaching ICT for D, apart from researching it, has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. It's very hard to give a date of birth to our field, but if we go with some of the literature, dating like putting the date of birth of our field to perhaps the 80s, when computers actually started being diffused in the so-called developing countries, term that we will problematize a lot, I expect, in the next few days. We started by studying very much the idea of how to bring technology to the so-called developing countries, and we today have changed a lot. We actually study a phenomenon, and I cite here colleague Richard Hicks from the University of Manchester, called adverse digital incorporation. So ICT for D became in many ways the study of how we actually get harmed and not get benefited in vulnerable countries, in vulnerable geographies by technology. Studies of surveillance, studies of adverse datafication, studies of violent border policing are increasingly the center of attention of ICT4D. So has technology brought good? If we look at ICT4D today, the best, let's say the most positive answer we can give is probably very problematic. Second thought provocation, and that's the good news, with which I wanted to begin our discussion today, is that citing indeed the quote from Seamus Heaney that the Dean just made, we are also becoming very much a field that studies hope, exactly because of the increasing harm, of the increasing, tomorrow morning we are going to talk about digitally induced harm induced specifically by digital identity technology. So in the light of harm, in the light of adverse digital incorporation, we are more and more becoming a field that studies hope, and a field that studies how aspiration to what Jeff Walsham in 2012 called a better world. We're making a better world with ICTs. So exactly in the light of harm and adverse digital incorporation, we are becoming a field centered on how to aspire to a more equal world, on how to really repurpose the technologies that have been technologies of oppression in so many cases to really build the hope we need for a better world. That was maybe about 5 Italian minutes, but that was what I want to share. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Give us just one with a brief as to all the Quilligana, the town shop, I guess, go over and the Dini, according to our show, the Kayla. I'm a primary school teacher originally. It's not usual I end up on a distinguished panel like this. I always speak in Irish when I go away, because first of all, it gets people's attention, and secondly, it does give the lessons that are not from the mainland in the UK, as most people think we're joined to. Our own work in relation to, I suppose, 3 things I just want to start with, tying back. One is that I was struggling with the 7 minutes. I was coming into Dublin Airport the other night, looking to change the bus because I live in Galway. Asked the air hostess, what time are you landing at? She went in, came back out. She said, what time are you on the bus? I said, well, I'm on at 9:30. I'm looking to book at 11:30, but there is one at 10:30. And she looked and said, that is the longest answer I ever got to a simple question. So I tend to overtalk, so cut me short. 2 things. One, earlier I was sitting there wondering, I'm not a researcher, what am I doing here? And then Dr. Pat put up the slide with Henry Ford. And that's me. I'm the kind of person who starts something and then begins to actually bring the research in afterwards. It's quite often an idea, and I talk about 3 different things from a practical point of view that we've been doing. One is 2016, 15, we've been sitting in City West with SAP, which is a big German software company. We've come off EU Code Week, where Ireland had more events than all of the rest of Europe almost combined. Because in Ireland, you can get that sense of community going with Code of Williamson was saying, could we run EU Code Week in Africa? And I was like, no, but we could run Africa Code Week. I found myself 4 months later in Paris with a group of 20 people. They all said, what a great idea. And let's wait till next year. And my response was, yeah, you have a choice. I have already bought the domain names for africacodeweek.com, .org, .net. Which one do you want? And of course, we went for .org, and it was like, okay, so now we've got a website, let's get going. We wound up actually last week handing over to 10 countries, because that was always the North Star, get countries to bring coding onto the curriculum. We had a meeting with them in the south of France, and the numbers are like, it would be 16 million over the last number of years. But we have a footprint across 48 countries. I didn't go to 48 countries, but this is where technology allowed me to have conversations with many people across the country. Building on that, we have a lot of young people that were never involved in coding, and who now are actually running their own companies, either teaching other young people about coding. And so I'm now started introducing a robotic competition across Africa. And this came about because they went to the World Finals last year, 90 countries, but only 3 countries from Africa represented. And I said, this is wrong. I mean, we know what's the difficulties here when you don't have people represented at that level. And so this is where I live in hope. This is the second part I was going to say. I have to live in hope because I have to live in hope that people will actually come along with me, believe my story, trust me. And I also have to live in hope that I will convince someone to give the funding for it. So working with initially with the Irish embassies, who we've worked with in many years, getting small funding from individual embassies, we now, since the start of the year, been able to work we had a pilot in Tanzania, we've run in South Sudan, Mozambique. We will in the next few weeks we're running in Zimbabwe, we will run in Mozambique, Rwanda, and Uganda by the end of November. The fact we've introduced it into those countries means we can now build on that. The second part was I was able to get Google in as a partner, as a funder. And again, that was solely because we just had to live in hope someone comes. The final part is answering the question about technology. One of the benefits that came out of COVID is Zoom. Obviously, we can run, we call it continuous professional development for teachers. Because tomorrow morning I have to miss part of the conference because we're in our 5th year of running 6-week CPD. We generally have about 60 to 70 women, depending on what's happening on the continent. We've had from over 40 countries because we run it in English and French, and we run it on Zoom. Our aim has always been, and it's now achieved, to never see a man, no man has been on. It's a sacred space for women, where they really open up to each other. You never see me, but what's key is it's now run totally moderated by women from the continent of Africa. We've taken a 6-stage process from starting as participants to actually now leading the whole group. So that's the benefits I see of technology. I've seen it from the young people. I've seen it from the introduction in coding into countries. And yeah, there are downsides, but there are also lots of positives. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me here. Excuse me. So I'm a lecturer in UCC in the Department of French, and I've done quite a lot of work in the Great Lakes region of Africa, particularly in Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC. But I'm just beginning a new project at the moment that looks at medical and media narratives of the COVID-19 from across the continent. And so I'm going to approach the question from a point of view of digital media, drawing on some of the insights from the paper that I'll deliver tomorrow, which looked at the way that the pandemic was narrated in the online media within Burundi and also in Belgium about Burundi. So thinking about how the media, digital media, could be useful for SDGs with particular reference to kind of health outcomes, it's often considered to be something of like a game-changing technology. There's been quite a lot of research into how social media, for example, could be used to provide health information and can be a kind of an interactive tool that may be used in remote areas. And the level of internet penetration that's been growing in Africa and the spread of mobile phone technologies has been cited as one of the reasons why these technologies may be so successful for spreading health information. For example, there's a study by Abedayo Fayoyin who looks at how social media were used to promote, to contain the Ebola outbreak in Nigeria, to contain HIV in Ghana, to promote a vaccination program for polio in Somalia, and so on. So there's definitely a lot of potential for these technologies. Although even Fayoye himself, who has written about this potential, he warns against new media utopianism. I would say I'm really more of a media studies person, and I'm also an African studies person. And I can say that techno-optimism is not something that is particularly new, particularly with regards to media systems in Africa. So, of course, there are the structural issues about, access to these technologies. That's one of the big problems. But another problem is the fact that social media and online media, digital media, they exist within political systems. So there's a big rise in so-called citizen journalism, for example, in Africa, which potentially gives access to anybody with a mobile phone to be able to contribute to commentary about politics and economics or whatever they want to online. And that obviously also opens up the potential for the transmission of misinformation. So that's one potential, danger of these technologies. But more than that, I would say that there's also a big problem in many African countries to do with media laws, because the media systems that exist in many countries are the inheritance of colonial systems. And so there's quite a lot of potential for African governments to be quite overreaching in terms of the way that they may limit the freedoms that people have online. And on top of that, there's a lot of state control over media in a lot of countries. So many media outlets tend to act as channels to publicize what the government is doing, rather than perhaps provide information that could be potentially useful to citizens. And this is what I found in my study looking at the Burundian context, where the local reporting presented Pierre Nkurunziza, the president at the time of my study in 2020, as a benevolent democratic leader, even a spiritual leader. And there was very scarce reference to the pandemic at all. In fact, it was barely mentioned in the local media coverage. They didn't mention the fact that the government had ejected the World Health Organization, which was there supposedly to help with the country's implementation of the response to the pandemic. And even when it came to reporting Nkurunziza's death, there was no mention of COVID, even though he allegedly died of the disease. So anytime that the COVID pandemic was mentioned, it tended to be kind of trivialized and ridiculed. And that was paired with kind of religious and political reassurances, suggesting that the government was in complete control of the situation. So that's the kind of legacy of the fact that most of the media systems were kind of introduced by colonial powers, and then they were kind of taken over by the kind of post-colonial governments. It's not in every country, but it's a tendency, and was definitely the case in my Burundian case study. But of course, Western media systems also reflect the legacy of political and social histories. And although they enjoy relative freedom in comparison to many press systems on the African continent, there's also a tendency to represent hegemonic voices in Western media as well. So I'm also very influenced by kind of decolonial approaches to media studies in my work. And as my paper tomorrow will show, that in my analysis of the way that the pandemic in Burundi was presented in the Belgian press, was that they basically highlighted all of the mistakes that Burundi was making, but without giving any kind of historical reference to the way that epidemiology had been practiced in Africa in the past. So, for example, in Burundi, during the colonial period in 1900 to 1940, there was an outbreak of sleeping sickness, and the way that epidemic was handled was to herd people into camps, separating them possibly permanently from their families, not giving them sufficient food and then injecting them with atoxyl, which is an arsenic compound that made 20% of people blind. So there's a reason for this kind of skepticism towards some of the kind of measures surrounding the pandemic. And none of this was mentioned, of course, in the Belgian press. They just basically made Nkurunziza out to be kind of like a kind of a crazy, you know, COVID denier. And become quite interested in the coloniality, actually, of epidemiology more generally, particularly the work of Eugene Richardson, who argues that epidemiology, like the media, is in clear need of decolonizing. And he argues that since the colonial period, the dominant logic for epidemic disease containment has dictated isolation of sick individuals with little in the way of patient care. He found that in his work during the Ebola outbreaks, for example, many health clinics simply functioned to isolate sick patients while at most providing oral rehydration. And the discourse surrounding that outbreak reproduced the symbolic violence of colonialism. And as my paper tomorrow will show, that the Belgian news outlets did similarly with regards to their representations of the pandemic in Burundi, suggesting that they basically accentuated Burundi's poverty and need for Western assistance in order to be able to cope with the situation. So returning to the issue of whether digital media may be particularly useful with regards to health outcomes in developing countries in Africa, I would argue that there's definitely a great amount of potential for spreading life-saving information, but those media exist within broader kind of cultural and political media systems that are in dire need of decolonizing. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I was trying to figure out if it was going to be harder to go first on this panel, and now I'm absolutely convinced I have the really hard job because I'm feeling very intimidated here by my incredible colleagues here. So yeah, thanks for that, Corey. The other thing I want to say is it's great to be here. This was always the first conference that went on my calendar every single year, and I really missed it when we couldn't be physically together during COVID. So I've been so looking forward to just coming here and just geeking out, getting to talk about technology and development for the next 2 days. Thanks, Petronella, Kira, Miriam, you guys have done a great job setting this up. So just to say that as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is PJ Wall. I'm currently working in TU Dublin, and I have worked in Trinity for many years. I've been involved in development and technology for development for a very long time at this stage. I've worked in places like Guyana in South America as on a consulting project for Irish Aid, going back a long number of years at this stage. My PhD work was on developing mobile health systems in Sierra Leone. I currently have 2 PhD students. One of them is just finished actually and resubmitted final corrections last week. So hopefully he's done. Both of them have worked on that project as well in Sierra Leone on the mobile health project. I'm currently working with Professor Tim Savage, who I think I see up the back there still, on a really cool project on technology for global development and sustainability. And all of these projects, I will take this opportunity to be maybe a little bit controversial and maybe set the tone for some conversation to follow. You could make an argument that even though I'm extremely interested in having impact, as we discussed earlier on today, all of my work has been specifically designed to be decolonized, as Caroline touched upon, and have impact, as we spoke about this morning. You could argue that a lot of those projects didn't really achieve what they were meant to achieve. Silvia quoted a good friend of mine who I've published with and who I work with, a guy called Professor Richard Heaps from Manchester. One of his most quoted papers states that 80% of technology for development projects fail. And I think that might even be a conservative estimate, because I think a minimum of 80% of technology for development projects fail. we could maybe get into an argument about what failure means, but I think that he probably means in that context that they don't really scale effectively, or they don't achieve the objectives that they were set out to achieve. So for me, just looking at the name of this particular conference and this panel, it is quite striking, because I think I would probably argue that the promise of technology for development hasn't been fulfilled. I can look back a number of years where back in Guyana in South America, I was trying to computerize, just using basic computers, computerize health systems. It didn't really work. Mobile health projects, that was a huge buzz for a number of years. Everything was going to be solved by the ubiquity of mobile phones and very fast cellular signal all across the world. Did it really solve anything? Yes, it did. But did it achieve the promise that we all thought it was going to achieve? I'm not so sure. And again, I'm being a little bit, trying to be a little bit controversial here. Now we're talking about AI. And people like me are coming up here to panels like this and saying AI is going to revolutionize everything. It's going to solve the climate crisis. It's going to do wonderful things. But I'm just not sure. I've yet to be convinced. And one of my PhD students who's actually presenting a paper tomorrow morning, which is a wonderful paper. She's in the first session. Kathy Roach is her name. She's so if you have some free time, come and hear Kathy talk. She's done some excellent work on the fact that AI systems are created by people just like me, white, very well educated from wealthy countries in the global north. How can we possibly design systems which can meet the needs of people in totally different sociocultural contexts? And I think this is the key. The interventions that we make in technology are made by predominantly people just like me. And I design systems and I design interventions that solve my problems, or at least problems that I think that I might have. I really have no idea of the problem somebody in a community health worker in Sierra Leone, where Petronel is going to be going in the field very soon. I really have no idea what problems or what kind of life those people have. So how can they be expected to solve their problems? I'll finish now, but just to talk a little bit about the project that Tim and I are working on. We visited India, Ethiopia, Uganda, a number of different countries over the past 12 months, looking at technological interventions to solve sustainability. We were expecting to find mobile phones. We were expecting to find technology. We were expecting to find computers. We didn't find any of that, I think, Tim, it's fair to say. What we found were pots crafted by local artisans that filtered water. That's a sociocultural appropriate response to having undrinkable or unusable water in Rajasthan. It's not AI. AI is not going to solve that problem, but a pot created by a local potter will. And I think I'll just hand back to
Great. Thanks very much, PJ. Okay, I have a few comments and thoughts, but we'll open it up to the floor to begin with. So is there a roving mic here, or do people just have to speak loudly?
I think probably speak loudly, or if
Okay.
it's very quiet, I can do some work.
Okay.
Thanks so much, and just for getting us speaking. Karen, I was interested, I suppose your own comment maybe it was time about citizen journalism, and I'm from a health background, not journalism, but was negative in the sense of linking it with misinformation. When then colonial context is much more likely to, as you mentioned, like bring misinformation about, in a much higher level and probably depress local knowledge. And I'm thinking of something in particular, which I was in a long time for a family, and there was an election coming out, and there was real kind of hope coming out of, like, I think it was Facebook at the time, with kind of local election, exit polls when people were leaving, and there was a real kind of sense that this was actually what was happening. And then, of course, the results came out completely different for other reasons. And then the hope was gone because the local truth, I can imagine, was quashed by the machinery of the state. So did you, was that deliberate, kind of that the citizen journalism would be linked with misinformation? Or what are you thinking there?
I mean, in general, I agree with you that citizen journalism is typically a good thing. The comment I made, sorry, I was kind of maybe going through it a bit too quickly because I was conscious of time. So it just means that, information that's not been fact checked when it comes to medicine could be circulating. So, citizens obviously are not trained in kind of science and health education. So there's the potential for misinformation to be spread. However, there's a recent edited volume out that's looking at new media ecologies, and generally speaking, it gives quite a positive appraisal of citizen journalism. The more negative point I was trying to make, and perhaps I skipped over it a bit too quickly, is that despite the existence of the potential for citizen journalism and for social media to exist, the problem is that many governments have a greater amount of control and actually prevent kind of forms of association online, or channel it so that it can only be done in certain ways, or as in the case you've done, allow them to speak but then override what's being said. So whether or not they really have the real power that they could potentially have is up for debate, because media systems are still kind of quite state controlled in a lot of countries. And so even though there's the potential for, all of this freedom of expression and sharing of information, it's not necessarily being realized in every potential case. Like, for example, the big media shutdown in Burundi and in South Sudan and so on. There's a lot of media blackouts. When the government doesn't want people really to speak, they can prevent it if they want to. So that was more the point. It's not to really say that citizen journalism is a bad thing, because it isn't.
Thanks. Do we have other questions from the floor? Yeah, go ahead. You just want to introduce yourself as well.
Paul Dean is my name. I'm interested. My area of research is computer games and development. The proposition I want to put to panel maybe is like you've mentioned colonization and decolonization from the sort of political perspective. But could I suggest that the corporate interests that control technology are themselves a colonizing force? And I suppose the pattern of accumulating regions and people smacks of techno-colonialism. And how concerned should we be about the Metas and Googles and the extent to which they are controlling, I suppose, the means by which people access development goods?
Okay, so we'll let the panel start. Do you want to respond first, Silvia?
Don't have a quick comment. Thanks for bringing in a super important actor in our conversation, which we're going to say was perhaps a bit of an absentee up to now. We did touch upon it, and that's the vendors of technology. We don't do ICT for development without the vendors of tech. And I think my quick reaction to your comment is I completely agree in terms of corporate interests that when we map actors in even beyond an ICT for development field, when we map actors in development interventions, we tend to put a lot of emphasis when ICT4D was born, the main emphasis was perhaps on the state. So all these interventions, most of them were seen as state-led, government-led. And then we shifted to this more multi-actor network, looking, for example, at how humanitarianism is becoming digitized. So this very transnational focus. But we can't look at the digitization of humanitarianism without seeing who sells the technologies that digitize borders, that digitize, and I'll bring up very quickly an example from my research. I look at digital identity, so technologies that identify in order to authorize for services. And tomorrow morning, actually, in the keynote, we're going to talk about something that in my work I conceptualize as unfair ID. So the moment in which unfairness is coded in the technology itself, for instance, by systematically excluding non-readable bodies that, for instance, a fingerprint reader or an iris scan reader doesn't read. And the question here is, in the digital identity field, a big blind spot is on vendors. We don't have only, I do cite the work of the one, published, very recently published paper in this area by Carolina Polito and Cristina Alaimo from Lewis University Rome, which is the one effort trying to map in the humanitarian sector the actors who are actually selling technologies and who is selling to whom. For example, one finding by Polito and Alaimo is that in the African continent, the great incidence of sellers of tech is from the giants, is from the Western giants that tend to that have, same finding from the same paper, at this time a remarkable tendency to buy each other. Is after all 3 or 4 companies that control the large share of biometric markets. So yeah, this is to say, indeed, to react to your point, we can't look at ICT4D without looking at who are the vendors and who they sell to.
Anybody else like to respond?
Thank you, Bert. I'll just respond very briefly. I would add to what you just said there, Paul. I think as academics, we sometimes do the same with the way we write, with the research philosophies and methodologies that we adopt, which are all very global north-based philosophies. I recently wrote a paper, I think it was published about 6 or 8 months ago, on the decolonization of philosophy, theory, and methodology. And I think that that's really important if we want to try to get to the heart of the real problems that exist and try to figure out ways, socioculturally appropriate ways, to try to solve these problems.
With regards to media, it's I think the figure of Elon Musk is quite interesting, because obviously he's breaking a lot of the rules in comparison to some of the other big tech firms. I don't know what the future is going to be with regards to Twitter or X. I know that he's starting to make people have to pay, isn't it, to access, which could have a negative effect for rural developing like countries with people living mostly in rural areas and things like that. But for the most part, those people wouldn't necessarily have access to online technologies anyway. And obviously, one of the things he's doing is kind of liberalizing what you're allowed to say, isn't it, on Twitter? So. I guess that gives scope for a broader range of opinions, which may be a positive thing. I don't have a general conclusion about that, but I think it's just worth mentioning that it's a more of an unusual case in respect to the other vendors of technologies. Maybe other people have more comments about that.
As the bad guy in the room who's aligned with these technology. I always said with SAP, no school, no education institution would be ever able to afford their technology. So they were never going to sell anything in Africa. So it was a genuine CSR. In relation to Google, again, they've nothing in robotics. It's strange. They have absolutely nothing going on to sell. So we're working with Microbit, which is actually Microsoft. Arduino, which is independent, and Vex, so it's different programs. And you work, going back to what you said, you work with what they have in the community, is what you have to do. I just say, I mean, it's like the whole thing of engaging people. I just give you an example. We work with the MIT Foundation, who look after Scratch, who created Scratch. And on a call with their senior team one day, one of them was saying, how is it we just cannot get young people in Africa engaged? And Adi, who was on the call, we could see it, because he was Nigerian. He said, because young people do not recognize any of the sprites. They're all Western sprites. And it was like this moment where they were like, oh, we never thought of that. And in fairness, within a month, they got a Kenyan young artist to create a whole new set of sprites that are African and that we could then use in our materials that we use with young people and the teachers in the schools. And again, we were always careful. We always worked on SDG ideas and promoting environmentalism but it's local based because it's always the teachers that create it for us. Finally, to say, going back to communities and research, I'm kind of the opposite, PJ. I've luckily we exceeded what we thought we might do, no matter what we're doing. So maybe we come at it like totally innocent, but I'm open to saying that. But just thinking, I think we're lucky in education because teachers still have a really strong influence in their communities. So if you work with teachers and technology and legacy, particularly women teachers, they can make a real difference in their community. We work with them on design thinking and the projects. They've never come back to us looking for more IT in the classroom, more curriculum issues. It's always focused on actually health issues. How do we get girls, through the difficulties they're having in relation, keeping them in school, early childhood marriage, etc. And they go away then and look at this and do their own research. So two things are just little projects. One was just taking what you were saying earlier, Caroline. There's an island called Sao Tome and Principe, which is a Lusophone island off the coast of Africa. And it's not well known, but there was a vaccination program on there, I think in the 40s, which went completely wrong. I mean, you think about it, where do you run a vaccination program? Do you think it's dodgy? On a remote part, on a remote island, out in the middle of the ocean. There's intergenerational deafness there. The teachers we work with, over 2 brilliant women on that small island, they went and spent a week, brought the computers, taught the young people how to code, opened up a world for them. And you see the photographs from there, you realize, wow, this actually was impactful in that community. Because there was technology giving them an opportunity. They still go back and they keep working with them. And so that's, to some degree changing. The second piece just for research, on a local research. Our first time we were running a women empowerment program, the teachers in Morocco couldn't figure out why girls weren't coming from rural areas to their schools. And because they're science teachers, went out, used the scientific method and went and actually interviewed the young girls. They met them in community areas, followed them. The issue was that the girls were being abused on the buses. They're being sexually interfered with on the buses as they were going to school, on the public buses. And they couldn't tell their parents because of the culture. And so the women, having done the research, the teachers went to the local authority and they showed us a bit of video and they lobbied them. And we were coming off the final program when one of the women actually was on the mobile phone and we cut to her and she just got a phone call and she said, we just got a call to say the local authority will provide 2 buses to bring those girls every day to school on their own from those rural areas. So I think that's kind of taking technology as we put you through Zoom, then inspiring. It's local solutions quite often. People do general things, it's difficult, but I think local solutions make best impact. And it's the people themselves creating those local solutions that make the impact.
Okay, I saw there was another few hands, so yeah. Go ahead and back. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Very interesting topic, technology and development. Now, Silvia said something about it that you made reference to. Although you posed a question, is technology good? And I think we need really kind of in order to speak about that. But this is about ideas, the tools, and selling them. Now, years ago, a friend once said, I'd love to shake the hands of the salesman who sold the first fax. Yes. To buy a fax, you have to make sure that somebody else has the right to communicate. So it must be an amazing salesman to persuade somebody to buy a fax machine or the very innovation fax machine some people before I need to then So yeah. So the whole thing about technology that okay, how do you then introduce something new to somebody else? and in this case, from Europe to Africa. That's the value. The second bit then is the resources. I'm just going to focus on them. I was thinking about the ethical issue here. Somebody mentioned Sierra Leone. I came across a book by a woman, Joan Baxter. She lived in West Africa for 30 years, 7 countries, traveling in 27 other countries. She wrote about a mineral called rutile. Now, hardly, like if you go to a room, I bet that you didn't find somebody, to find somebody who hasn't got a mobile phone. Now, rutile is the mineral of that and other items too. The result of that mining of rutile is that local farms like land is destroyed. So the locals who probably are happy enough self-sufficient, they have been displaced, and now they all want to go to Europe. The other country, since we're talking about the climate, is the DRC, where cobalt is a big problem. So my question, for now, is how do we address these ethical issues when we depend upon things like retail, which would destroy Sierra Leone and cobalt? Thank you.
Thanks.
Where to even begin, but I must say the ethical issue was the other, I don't want to say big absentee because we did touch upon it, but I think you just unpacked it in a very clear way. So big thanks for that. I don't even know whether it's more a question for me or something that really touches upon what was said. I'll take a stab at it, and I think the first step, and this I say with my ICT for Development research hat, to deal with the ethical issue is to acknowledge and recognize our own positionality in the research space. I want to comment on them. I did not conduct research on the cases of, for example, DRC that you just mentioned, but I am someone that from a clear positionality, where here I quote PJ, like I'm in many ways an outsider to most of the communities I work with. I work mainly with identified people, so people identified through digital ID technologies in the south of India. And I think the first step is establishing and discussing and problematizing our positionality in the field we research. Many, like what I've learned, it's this is my 14th year working with the largest biometric identification program worldwide. It's India's digital identification scheme. Is even looking at a macro technology, a technology that covers 29 states and 7 special territories, like the real understanding of like the real moment in which the person forms a view of the technology is when they actually encounter it. So the technology is not so much the database, like the underlying database and the millions invested in it. It is the moment in which the person enters the slum, the village, identifies with a fingerprint, and does or does not get their eyes. As we will see tomorrow, in many cases, does not. So for me, it's very much being in the place, in the moment in which the person encounters the technology, and also problematizing who am I in that, who are we as researchers to enter that space and to perceive and to form those understandings. So that's my stab at the ethical question. I wonder if my colleagues have.
That's a really tricky question. I was hoping nobody was going to say anything about ethics. Ethics is very, very tricky, and it's become an incredibly popular, fashionable topic to talk about in development studies these days. I couldn't agree more with Silvia. Ethics is in the eye of the beholder to some extent. What's right to me might not be right to a soldier in Ukraine or to somebody in Gaza right now. It's very, very, very difficult to figure out what's right and wrong. And unfortunately, there's no simple answer to this. We have been using a tool called the ethics canvas which was developed by some of the very smart people I work with in Trinity. There's currently a project ongoing to iterate that particular ethics canvas. If you just Google ethics canvas, you'll see it. But it's designed for people, again, a bit like me, who live in the global north, who are well educated. There's a talk of an iteration of that ethics canvas to be more socio-culturally appropriate for maybe people in the global south. But it is a really, really tricky question. And I think one of the keys to maybe trying to move a little bit more towards solving these questions is to try to figure out decolonialized ways of looking at what right and wrong means, which is at the core of ethics. But yeah, it's a very, very tricky one.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'm afraid I don't have a very optimistic or kind of easy solution or anything. I'm a scholar in the humanities, and I've worked on post-genocide Rwanda since 2010, and I teach a course about the legacies of colonial violence in the DRC and Rwanda, and the problems of that region are so deeply complex and so deeply troubling that I don't think we can just say, oh, there's a solution like this or that. Those minds in the DRC have funded violence since 1996, and the exploitation of Congo's resources goes back to the slave trade. From the exportation of people, then to ivory, then to rubber, and then eventually to the materials that go into our new technologies, as you mentioned, coltan, cobalt, titanium, all sorts of minerals that the DRC is so rich in. And it's because of our hunger for those technologies that the greed, internationally for those technologies, and for actually, you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's almost preferable to keep the DRC in the state that it's in order to keep, having easy access to those mines. I think the question of decolonization, we've thrown that word around quite a lot, and it's so much more complicated than, just a simple word. The United Nations peacekeeping mission has been in the DRC, I think, since 1998. It's a so-called peacekeeping mission. It's not effective. It hasn't ever kept the peace. It's been one of the most expensive, at times the most expensive UN mission. And yet there's endless accusations of the UN being involved in the violence, being involved in the massive sexual exploitation of local women, and even involved in the exploitation of the minerals as well. And I think this is just, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for it, other than just to say that when we use this word decolonization, it sounds simple, but it's really very deeply, deeply complicated. And it involves really ceding power, and whether or not that's ever something that's going to be done voluntarily, I don't have I'm not so optimistic about it. So sorry, I'm bringing a bit of doom and gloom to the room on that question.
I'll come back to you if we have time. There's more questions up here. Rafi, oh no, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Akhil. I had a question for Carolyn. So during your research, did the business model of the digital media play an impact on what the sort of reporting was? For instance, if it was subscription-based platform, did they report it differently as against if it was more of a state-run organization? That is what I want to
Thank you for the question. I didn't really consider the business models so much as the intended audiences. So obviously, there's a sense that a media outlet will be writing for its anticipated readership, and so one of the reasons that we get these kind of almost that sort of repetitive story about conflict or whatever, be a health issue or whatever, we get these kind of, the story stays the same, just the actors change. And it's almost because our audiences expect that same story over and over again. So like the kind of generic features of the stories kind of stay the same, but we just change the actors. And I think that's to do with kind of the anticipated readership and what they want to hear, basically. So it's very rare that we get stories that are very challenging to the readership. But I didn't look into the business models, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Okay, you have some questions here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a little bit murky in my mind that you guys are making me think about some things. But really, PJ's the one that triggered the thought, talking about the clay pot and the more purification. When we think of technologies, it's often the cutting edge technology, the oh my gee whiz technology, right? And that usually is what triggers the word technology in people's minds. But the other end of the spectrum of technology is the Caledonian crow, who's sharpening a stick to get bugs out of a tree and sharing that information with other crows and sort of trying to play new technology developments. But that's the other end of the extreme, right? But how do we really not always be thinking about the cutting edge technology, which is going to be making money, which is going to be looking for new markets to exploit, to have consumers, but how do we really take our technology back to the best solution, or go back to Occam's razor, the simplest solution being corrected? So that's, and how do we even change the feedback cycles that are pushing us to the high tech kind of thing? So that's just a sort of a, and there's an ethical dimension to that, there's a philosophical dimension. But is there a way to really change that sort of feedback? And be looking to the global south for our solutions. Because when we look at, say, responsible consumption with SDG 12, it's not a problem in the global south, it's a problem in the global north. So how do we sort of learn also that?
Thank you so much.
Just on a practical example, and I'm going back again to giving and working with people to have the tools to research themselves. So a practical example is we have a group of women who went off a couple of weeks ago looking at how could they support girls in relation to their monthly cycle. And of course, everyone thinks they're going to come back with an apple. They went, and having looked at it, they came back with a paper calendar because they realized the girls didn't understand what a month was. So this is just what you're saying, but it was the local women themselves, through their own research, that come up with that solution. And then you start from there. So I think we were struck with that lately because everyone thought we were going to come back with something like that. And it was no, this is where we come from.
I'll pass this one.
Okay, we have other questions. I'll come to you in a minute.
Yeah, my name is Eamon, and I'm from Mission Cara, and we support mission development organizations doing international development work. And my question, I suppose, is it bounces off the idea of the ethics, but it's a slightly different one. It's about ownership and control, I suppose. And something that was mentioned earlier, that most of the systems that have been set up that would regulate or that might invigilate the technologies and the intellectual properties and the accumulation of wealth were based on state systems, and now transnational corporations are effectively getting bigger and more powerful than the state systems we have set up to establish them. So is there a danger, I suppose, of of kind of by promoting technology, that we're promoting downstream gains like IT in classrooms, like weather apps for farmers that may have utility, but at the cost of giving over control of technology, control of ownership, control of intellectual domains, and building in a whole new post-colonial cycle.
Those were two really insightful comments from the audience. Thank you both very much. That was really fantastic. I'll keep this brief because I'm tempted to sort of give a very long answer to that, but I'll keep it brief and relay a story that struck me. I still think about this to this very day, actually. It was during my PhD work a good few years ago in one of the most rural parts of southern Sierra Leone, where Ebola had a huge impact subsequently, and there had been pretty vicious atrocities during the Sierra Leone Civil War. Extremely low resource context with almost nothing in the health centres. And I arrived down there, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, with a mobile phone in my hand, with the app that we had built to help the community health workers, and I showed it to the nurse. And I said, look at what this can do. Isn't this amazing? Isn't this brilliant? And she was very polite. And she looked at the phone and she said, that's fantastic, but what we need here is mattresses. We currently have 5 women who are about to give birth. And look at this bed, it doesn't have a mattress. And that struck me to my core. Then I thought, what the hell am I actually doing here? You know, maybe I should be designing a project that gets mattresses into these health centres as opposed to trying to develop some form of digital technology that maybe they don't even need. And I'm not going to try to answer that my own question, but it did strike me from those two fantastic comments from the audience.
Quick remark, I completely agree. Two very thought-provoking comments, and I guess my quick reaction to both of them is I think we actually I opened today with the notes that ICT4D became in many ways, ICT for development became in many ways the study of harm. So the study of, again, how this, and I quote again this notion of adverse digital incorporation. And I think both comments, the second comment, so this idea of where control shifts, and again, I link back to the question asked before on vendors. So these power shifts, in many ways invisible at the realities that we research. I think all the colleagues today spoke about very localized realities, and again, it is a prerogative in my research to be where the person meets the technology. But I think a big part of ICT for development is what is not immediately seen. So, for example, the power shifts that you just mentioned, and it's and again briefly on the comment made before on the localized understandings of what ICT really is. I guess I'll just reiterate the note that, like, being where the person meets the technology. Vijay, you just gave a brilliant example of that, and I will add very briefly to that. So what the technology means in that particular context. You recently published a paper on ICT for development, on IT for development, on the meaning of doing AI research in the global south. And I think, I don't know if you were going to mention that paper, but one of the reflections you make is that the very meaning of AI really sometimes is devoid of this idea of artificial when it comes to the localized realities of people meet technology. So, yeah. Great paper.
I'm going to be the person to bring optimism again now. About high technologies. I just want to cite some examples in Rwanda where digital media have been very useful for giving a voice to local people in order to write their own history in a much more in a way that can be accessed internationally. So one of the organizations I've worked with for the last 14 years or so is the Aegis Trust, which is an anti-genocide charity that runs the National Memorial and Genocide archive in Kigali, and the Aegis Trust arrived in Rwanda in about 2004, 10 years after the genocide took place, and were invited to establish this memorial. And they knew, like very early on, that they needed to start documenting what had happened. And so they basically just, with very few expertise, worked with local people, picked up a video camera and started interviewing people. And bit by bit, the memorial became, it attracted funding from international donors. And the kind of digital archive became extremely complex, and they've collected hundreds of testimonies from survivors, perpetrators, and others. And with that funding, they actually were able to invest in the skills locally, so that they gave people the ability to make documentaries, for example, and make very, very high-tech, sophisticated online content. So they have now this really unique state-of-the-art digital museum where they are able to produce, they've got testimonies of people that survived. They've also got lots and lots of video documentaries and things like that. And so this is an example where actually high tech is able to really offer serious empowerment with regards to the question of decolonization. For example, when it comes to Rwanda's history, it's mostly been written by outsiders for the last 100 years or so, in terms of whether it's by journalists, historians, or authors. And this is one way that Rwanda is able to kind of narrate its own history. And one of the things that people often complain about is that there's no, books about Rwanda written by Rwandans themselves. And this digital museum is creating a great amount of local expertise, where there's now like this big group of kind of intellectuals that get invited to speak at international conferences like this one, because of their expertise and their experience of creating this fantastic online material. So I wanted to not just be the doom and gloom person.
Great. And I think this might be our last question, or maybe I'll take two final questions. Yeah.
And I'd love if our panelists could just comment on the role of governments in technology, because I think that's one that's really missing. I know Caroline's spoken about kind of the role of government in curtailing what people can hear, or how media laws and how media can report. And on the other hand, I also wonder that kind of if governments would be a bit more proactive, maybe some of these health apps might be more successful, and also maybe in that context, first of all, the mattresses maybe in the clinic, and then you might be able to build on a more functioning system. I also wonder, Bernard, I know you've really been the optimist here, but I wonder, you're doing a lot of technology in the classroom. Are you doing that also in the context of an absent state in some cases, or a state that is only delivering a certain amount of what it really should be delivering? And I wonder if you could comment on that as well.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll take your question and read it as well.
Mine is more a comment, so.
Okay. Well, I'll let the panel answer, and then you can have the final word.
The answer is yes. There's such a variety of gaps in where we work across the continent. Some countries, Rwanda, is created a digital story about itself. Everyone knows what they're doing. You can straight off say Morocco, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria. They're on a different level than all of the rest. That's what we've always pushed hard. When I mentioned where we're working, we would call them the non-tech countries. But within those countries, there are a lot of really brilliant young people, really need opportunities, and are equally have a chance to be as good as the other nations across the continent. But I mean, that's the same here. Certainly, yes, in a lot of classrooms we are, and it's really working with teachers more than the students, because the teachers are the legacy. Because we train the teachers, they're in the system for a long time.
Just also a quick comment from me on the role of governments, super important actor in ICT for development. I think brief reaction, governments are huge technology buyers to begin with. And this relates, I guess, again to the point of the role of vendors that came up today. So governments, I think in the very briefly history of, I wasn't planning to draw so much on the history of ICT for development today, but it turns out like this, and we can talk more about that tomorrow. In the history of ICT for development, governments were actually seen at a point, perhaps in the initial phases of our history, very much as the leading actor in ICT for development. So state-led development programs, state-led food security, employment guarantee programs, you name it. And only more recently, this more problematized, more supranational idea of ICT for development really came up. I think as someone who studied digital identity, my immediate reaction is not to underestimate the role of governments as technology buyers. Like the biggest digital identity conventions are name just a couple, like the ID Week that was in Amsterdam this year, or ID for Africa, that is actually a convention where what happens, where sellers of biometric technology encounter government, encounter supranational organization representatives who are there for many reasons, primarily, I would argue, to buy potentially new identification systems. So that's a key dynamics of ST4D today.
I think I can do okay. I remember as well. What is the Sprite branch? You mentioned these.
Sprite is a little guy in Scratch, is what we use to teach coding. It's used here in Ireland in your primary schools. And the Sprite is a little thing that the Sprite is a little characters that you move across the screen that you get them through. So you can select what your Sprite is. It could be a cat, it can be a professor, it can be someone from any place in the continent. And they're the characters.
Yeah. Okay, we got the last word.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, just a few thoughts. I mean, first I want to caution, if I may, and press attention as a member of the DSI on the mentioning of Africa. You know, as you very well know, and actually I really appreciate Bernard never saying Africa was really specifying, you know, which country. It is not one place. You know, it's many. I'm saying to be obvious here. But imagine how we would feel in Ireland. I was thinking, especially again, from Bernard speaking Irish, if we were told Ireland, you know, I mean, then we would go up in our arms saying, actually, it's a Republic of Ireland versus North Ireland. Even if we said Dublin, it's North Dublin, or, you know, South Dublin, etc., etc. So that's just not, please, you know, not refer to the continent as the one place. Secondly, another thought as well, and again, we talked about the continent, and we talked about the local solution, we talked about the global south. It's actually disappointing not to see at least one, member of, in the panel from the global south.
We have tried, sorry.
Yeah, it has to do. Great. So yeah, I mean, I would love to see that more. And lastly, again, going back to the question of the technology as good or as whatever, or as failed, I think it goes back to really future. It's no more than what Bernard was saying. Clearly, we see I'm fine, right? And I'm speaking now as a practitioner and having seen actually the premise of the technology in the ground. If you work with other people, if you're led by other solutions, and no more than for any development project, then you can be sure or more likely to succeed. So I don't think really it's on the technology; it's more on the approach, if you like, that we have, the philosophy, if you like, it was said. So. Yeah, just that's what I wanted to say.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm sure you'll all agree with me that this was a fantastic way to open the conference. It's been really thought-provoking. I've come away, I've learned a lot. Got me thinking through the whole session. Maybe we've a lot of questions we can discuss in our panels and in our plenaries and so on tomorrow. So I hope you enjoyed it as well. And with that, I'd just like to thank all the speakers for their inputs and to thank you for your participation. Yeah. We'll move now to the reception, which I'm told is out that door, straight out that door. Okay, thank you.